Gracious God, be with us as we gather this day, as we have gathered to be fed and nourished by your word and sacrament. Feed us now as we continue to grow in this journey of faith that we walk together. Open our hearts, open our minds, and open us to hear you and each other as we gather this day. We ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Well, again, welcome to all of you gathered on Zoom and all of you gathered here in person. We need to keep in mind that if anyone needs to say something, I'll need to repeat it because the folks on Zoom can hear what I'm saying through this microphone, but they won't hear you if you say anything in this room. So as I've pointed out, this series is about, all are welcome. What does that look like in the Christian tradition? And we have these 4 sessions we're talking about: Episcopal 101, Episcopal 102, Episcopal 103, and Episcopal 104. It's a catchy phrase. Today is Episcopal 102, and that's my topic. And it is, what does it mean to belong to the Episcopal Church? That's the topic. And I sat with this for quite a while, and I'm taking an approach that may seem an approach you may not expect. We could go through different kind of writings of what it means. We could go through the canons of the church that define membership, all kinds of things like that. What I've chosen to do instead is to speak more from a experiential place. I think all theology is based on experience anyway. All spirituality is based on experience. And I'm going to share with you some of my experiences in my life about the significance of this, what it means to belong to the Episcopal Church. And I want to share my experiences, not that my experiences are so important you need to know them, but to kind of maybe model for you, invite you to perhaps reflect on your experience, and perhaps it will remind you of moments in your life that bring you around to understanding this question of what does it mean to belong to the Episcopal Church. So, before we even get into that broader question specifically, I'd like us to reflect on the experience of belonging itself. And I'm going to use notes. Many of you are accustomed to me preaching on Sunday with no notes, and I do that pretty comfortably. I never write anything down. Someone once said to me, could I have a text from that homily you gave a couple months ago? I go, it doesn't even exist. I don't write anything down. I don't write notes or anything. That's the way I'm able to preach. But when I'm teaching a session like this, I'm going to be using some notes. So I'll be reading along. So the style may be a little different than the way when I preach. So what does it mean to belong? That to me is one of the key phrases in that sentence. What does it mean to belong? What has belonging meant to you? What does it look like? What has belonging done in your life? And I want you to touch that this morning in your life, the significance of belonging. What does it mean to you when you hear that word, belonging? I'd like to begin by telling a bit of my story. So as I said, perhaps my story will invite you to reflect and gain some insight into your story, which I hope can lead us to the end of our time together to get a sense of what does it mean to belong to the Episcopal Church. And even more specifically, what does it mean to belong to St. Paul's, to be part of this faith community? Let me tell you my story. I grew up and belonged to Our Lady of the Rosary Church in Yonkers, New York. It's where I was born. It was called Holy Rosary for short. That was the name of the church. My parents moved there when they got married. They moved from the parish they had grown up in, which was Sacred Heart Church in Yonkers. And they moved and were married and settled in a different part of Yonkers. It became part of Holy Rosary. They moved there when they got married. I was baptized there by Father McDonald just 2 weeks after I was born in 1953. That's the way it was done then. 2 weeks later, you were baptized. I went to elementary school there. My mom, I have memories of my mom helping out in the school, helping out in the classroom, doing things that were going on during the day, after school activities. She helped the teachers, she helped the nuns, the sisters that were there. Her connectedness was really to the elementary school. The school was on the top floor of the church. It was this rather large church and a rather grand kind of building. And on the top, if you can picture this, was the school. And there were 8 classrooms. And I distinctively remember my dad one year removing all the fluorescent lights in each classroom and installing new ones. It happened to be that he was on strike. My dad worked for Weston Electric, and he was a union guy. And so they were on strike. And he wasn't one to just be at home. So there was a need to have the lights in all the classrooms he placed. And so my dad did that. I don't know how they did that, to tell you the truth. It was either after school during the day or on weekends. But I remember seeing him doing this. He replaced every light. He knew electricity. He knew carpentry. He once even built a boat. He was so talented and so handy. He had every tool that you could have. I, however, did not inherit that DNA. I used to tease my dad that he probably wondered, where did George come from? I just had no inclination or anything. My father passed away a few years, and the garage was full of tools. And I have most of them either at my house. I gave many of them to my son-in-law, and we have some up in our house in Cape Cod. We have so many tools. I don't even know what they do. But he was so talented, and that's how he connected. And I'll be honest with you, to this day here at St. Paul's, when I see folks, some of you who offer your time and your talent to tend to the buildings and tend to these facilities, I just remember my dad. I see my dad. One time I was here and guys were doing something, and little a secret, I got kind of emotional about it because I knew that's how my dad belonged. That's how he felt a connectedness. He was also the leader of a Boy Scout troop for 25 years. He saw a lot of young boys grow up and move on in their lives. I remember many of them coming back to thank my dad for the influence that he was on their lives. So for my mom and dad, that's what it meant to belong to Holy Rosary in Yonkers, New York. They gave of themselves in whatever way they could. They went with the talents that they had given and offered them to the community, and they did stuff. They belonged. They were also able to receive. Belonging is giving, but it's also receiving. When I was 4 years old, I had a sister, Joanne, who died when she was 9 months old from complications of Down syndrome. And what a time that was in my parents' life. You know, I was so young then. I have a few images in my mind of holding Joanne. I remember her face. I remember her, looking at me. And I was only 4, but I have that memory. And she passed away when she was 9 months old. What a time that was in my parents' life. Did I fully understand that when I was 4 years old? Maybe not, but I do now. I do now. Father McDonald, who baptized me, he was there for my parents during that time. He spent time with them, prayed with them. They had a little service. And my sister was eventually buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery in Yonkers, New York. And Father McDonald had a lot to do with supporting that and making that happen. So I grew up visiting Joanne's grave. We'd plant flowers there in the spring. I grew up in an apartment building, so there was no yard or garden. I remember vividly going to the cemetery where my parents went pretty regularly. Didn't understand probably as a child what that meant to them. But I would go and we'd plant flowers in the spring. Just a few years ago, my mom passed away, and she was buried there with Joanne. And a year later, some of you know during this time here at St. Paul's, both my parents passed away. A year later, my father passed away, and he was buried there with Joanne. With my parents passing away, I have no connection anymore to New York, even though I brag about New York and joke about New York. But there's no one living there anymore, any of my relatives. And so when I get a chance, I'll stop by the cemetery. A few weeks ago, I went up to Cape Cod for a couple weeks, and on the way driving, I stopped in Yonkers and went to the cemetery to visit with them. And it reminded me of Holy Rosary, because it always brings me back to that time and that experience of growing up and this being part of that. I mentioned Father McDonald and what he meant to my parents and what he meant to me as a child growing up. All the priests in my parish where we belonged were incredible, incredible individuals and priests. Father McDonald was also the City of Yonkers Fire Department chaplain. It was a big part of his life. He was involved and engaged in the firefighters' lives in the city of Yonkers, which is a pretty big city. And just a couple of years ago, at the age of 89, he passed away. And any of the obituary pictures you see, it's of him at 89 wearing that fire hat. It was a big part of who he was. And he was involved in the city in so much of what those folks did. So he had this sense of belonging going out and extending into the community of Yonkers itself. Father Gallagher was another priest in my parish where we belonged. He was someone who came and he fought and preached about affordable housing in Yonkers. This was back in the 1960s. He advocated for the construction of an apartment complex right across the street from the church that would be affordable and accessible for people. It wasn't always a popular message, but it was built. All the priests of my parish growing up had a tremendous influence on me. And in many ways, it's why I wanted to be a priest. I wanted to be like them. Ever since I was in first grade, I was one of those kids. Since first grade, I wanted to be a priest because I wanted to be like them. I would never be who I am today or what I do as a priest if not for those priests who served at the parish my family belonged to. So why do I share that personal stuff with you? For me, belonging was such a part of my early formation. It transformed me. My parish transformed me. And I think belonging continues to be transformative for me. So what does it mean to belong? For me, it means to be transformed. It means to grow. It means to move forward. It means to continually move in our lives, to realize that we're never really already there, but there's more to grow into and be a part of in our lives. Many folks today will say, I'm not religious. I'm more spiritual. I hear that phrase, I'm not religious, I'm more spiritual. And I hear that quite a bit. I think for many, it's they maybe have had a negative or bad experience of religion or of church or of parish life. But when I hear that phrase, I'm not really religious, I'm more spiritual, for me, they're inseparable. For me, they're like different, they're two sides of a coin. Remember what I often say, and you probably heard me say this in homilies, I think we are born spiritual. We all seek meaning in our lives. From the moment we're born, we seek meaning. And that, to me, that search for meaning is the spiritual search. So whether we are religious, whether we are atheist, whether we are agnostic, I think we all share that search for meaning. And I call that our spiritual side. See, I don't think that we're human beings trying to be spiritual. I think that we are spiritual beings trying to figure out what it means to be human. And what does it look like to be human? And I would suggest the scriptures give us a place to find that. The church community gives us a place to find that. What does it mean to be human? And the thing is, in that search for meaning, we can't be humans alone. We need each other. We belong to one another. Being religious is striving to live that, to take that spiritual search for meaning and belong to each other in that search and in that discovery that we walk together into. So I believe that search is not an individual search. Of course, each of us searches in our own lives from our own experience, but we can't do it alone. To me, that's one of the great, I once have said that the greatest denial of faith is, I can do it alone. We can't do it alone. We need each other. We belong to each other. So it's a search we all make together. And we need each other in that searching. That's where belonging comes in. So, what does it mean to belong? I think it means all of these things, and other things as well, I'm sure. The Jesuit Greg Boyle, who you've heard me quote before, I may have used this quote too as well. Since I don't write anything down, I don't remember what I've said in homilies. But let me just share this quote with you. He says, "We've forgotten that we belong to each other." We've forgotten that we belong to each other. And he says kinship. I love this word. He uses this word kinship. It could be another word almost for belonging, for community. Kinship is what happens to us when we refuse to let that happen. With kinship as the goal, belonging as the goal, I'm using the word belonging, other essential things fall into place. Without kinship, he says, there's no justice, there's no peace. He says, I suspect that were kinship our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we'd be celebrating it. It would already be among us. That search to remember we belong and what can happen when we remember that. So I give thanks that throughout my life, I've continued to grow and be challenged and transformed by the so many faith communities I've belonged to. I shared with you as my childhood in Holy Rosary Church in Yonkers, New York, which was recently torn down. Broke my heart. The building is one of those churches that just had to close. And they tore it down, and they've built a new high school there in Yonkers. But it's not the building. It's that memory of that sense of belonging when I was a child. So, that sense of belonging began at that church when I was a kid. And then it moved to Holy Innocents in Pleasantville, New York. When my parents moved from Yonkers, we moved to a new church, Holy Innocents in Pleasantville. It was a big move in my parents' life. No Adamic or Hinchcliffe had not lived in Yonkers. For 2 generations, 3 generations, my parents made the big move 25 miles north into Westchester County to Thornwood, New York, around Pleasantville. And we became part of Holy Innocents in Pleasantville. From there, my life took me to St. Barnabas in the Bronx, where I served as a deacon in a parish of 4,500 families. To St. Joseph's Church in Millbrook, New York. When I was first ordained a priest, that's a community that I belonged to and served. To Holy Rosary in the Bronx, it's another Holy Rosary. When I was teaching high school in the Bronx, I helped out in a local church called Holy Rosary in the Bronx. From there to the Church of the Messiah in Rhinebeck, New York, where Mary and I were married, and where I was received as a priest into the Episcopal Church. Then to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Pearl River, New York, where I was for over 7 years, belonging to that community that transformed me and was a part of my growing ever deeper in my life. And then finally here, 22 years ago, almost 23 years ago in February, I'm here to St. Paul's, where I continue to feel a sense that I belong. We belong together, and all who join us belong, and we're part of something. Our lives are transformed and changed. And so we belong to each other, and that belonging is not just about us now. Belonging is not just come in this door and belong, I suggest, but that belonging is a way where we learn what it means to belong. We teach each other. We discover what belonging means so that we can go beyond ourselves to belong. Bishop Rob Wright, the Bishop of Atlanta, has this wonderful phrase about the Diocese of Atlanta saying, we need to draw the circle wider. I love that phrase. Draw the circle wider. And so belonging is not just something we kind of close the doors and we all belong, but rather our belonging, we learn what it looks like, and as we bump into each other, we don't maybe always do it perfectly, but we try, we walk together, and we're called to expand that circle of belonging. Or as, again, my favorite my Jesuit friend Greg Boyle says, kinship is inching ourselves closer to create a community of kinship, a community of belonging, such that God might recognize it. God, yes, this is what you are called to be. And soon we can imagine with God a circle of compassion. Because when we belong to each other, there is compassion there. Then we can imagine no one standing outside of that circle, moving ourselves closer to the margins so that the margins themselves will be erased. Belonging is not about an us and a them. Belonging brings us all together. So we stand, as Greg Boyle says, I'm still quoting him, we stand there with those whose dignity has been denied. We locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. At the edges, we join the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. The prophet Habakkuk writes, the vision still has its time, and it presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. But if it delays, wait for it. Wait for it. We'll be entering into the season of Advent pretty soon, a season of waiting. We wait for that great hope, that great dream, that great sense of what belonging can really mean for us. So let me get back to that topic. All that's been about belonging. I hope that's raised some thoughts in your memory, in your lives, about what belonging can mean. And maybe there's moments where you didn't even realize what belonging has done for you in your life. It's very significant. Those relationships that we build. So let me get back to the topic. What does it mean to belong to the Episcopal Church? Let me take you on another story. This is my last story. I shared a story of my early childhood, but this is another story that it's what brought me to the Episcopal Church. And I invite you to reflect, what is it that brought you to the Episcopal Church? You may have been born in the Episcopal Church. You may have grew up in the Episcopal Church, but at some point you chose it. And some of us come from different places. Let me tell you about my journey and what it means for me to belong to the Episcopal Church. I thank Thomas Merton for bringing me to the Episcopal Church. Now, let me repeat that. I thank Thomas Merton for bringing me to the Episcopal Church. Now, some of you may not be familiar with Thomas Merton. For me, he is my primary. You hear me quote. I'm teased a lot about quoting Richard Rohr a lot, and I love Richard Rohr. But Thomas Merton is the one, and had a great influence on my life. Thomas Merton was a Roman Catholic Trappist monk who in the late 1940s entered the monastery, the Trappist monastery, and he wrote a book called The Seven-Story Mountain, which was an autobiography that he wrote. He was someone who grew up, in a sense, without really a faith tradition, although his family had some connections to the Anglican tradition, which is kind of interesting. But it really wasn't shaped or formed in that. He encountered, for him, a church in Manhattan, Corpus Christi Church in Manhattan, which I've been to quite a few times, and he went through a conversion there. And I won't tell you the whole story, but he eventually decided to become a Trappist monk in Gethsemane, Kentucky. And he wrote a book about that whole experience. And it came out in the late 1940s, and it was a bestseller. It was just after World War II, and it was that book that had a great influence on this influx of people into the monastic life. People coming out of that war, looking for meaning, trying to search for what life was about. For some, it took them to that kind of an experience. And Thomas Merton is credited with that kind of influx by sharing his life and his story. So I read that book in 1973. I was in college at the time. I was about 20 years old. And it was one of the greatest books I'd ever read. I just vividly remember it. I have about 2 or 3 copies of it at home, and here I have one in my office here. And it still is one of the most powerful books I've ever written. And it was written in the 1940s, in a different time, a different worldview, different kind of culture. But by reading that, hang in here with this story. So I became drawn to the monastic life because of reading that book, and wondered if I had a vocation to the Trappists. It's a particular community of monastic tradition. To follow that wonder, I went on quite a few retreats to a Trappist monastery called St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts. It was the closest Trappist monastery to where I lived in New York. And I went there many times. And to this day, all the vestments that you see me wear on Sundays or any time are from that monastery. They make vestments at St. Joseph's Abbey, and that was 1973, so do the math. So many years later, that place still has an influence on me, and all my vestments are made by monks. That's why I've got the hood on my alb. People say, what's with the hood on your alb? None of the other priests have hoods. It's this whole monastic influence. But that community became important to me, and it mesmerized me. There was something about it that made me feel like I was home. And I realized it was this Benedictine tradition. So hang in here with me. The Benedictine tradition. You may hear that phrase a bit. It was a tradition followed by many monastic communities, including the Trappists. That's kind of what was drawing me. I couldn't put my hands, I couldn't name it, I couldn't touch it. There was something drawing me. Saint Benedict wrote his rule of Saint Benedict, it's referred to, which was a rule about how to live in this monastic community. What was this to look like? This was something new. And he wrote that rule in the year 516. 516. And that rule, to this day, still guides monastic communities. I have a copy of it in my office that I read pretty regularly. And it's just a reminder of what that monastic contemplative life can look like. And the first word in the rule of St. Benedict, and this is very Benedictine, so hang in here with me. The first word of the rule of St. Benedict is listen. Listen. And it goes on, listen with the ear of your heart. That phrase, it hit me then, and it lives with me. Listen with the ear of your heart. I'm enthralled by that. So the monastic life is one of great silence in order to listen. Also at the heart of that rule of St. Benedict is hospitality. For St. Benedict, all are welcome was a part of the rule. Our sign outside is not something new. St. Benedict had that in 516. Hospitality was always at the heart of the Benedictine expression of Christianity. For the monastery, whenever someone came to the door, a stranger came, they were to be treated as Christ. Those in the monastery, stop doing what you're doing as someone enters, the stranger. There's even a line in the rule of St. Benedict where the abbot, who's sort of the leader of the community, comes to greet the guest and literally bows to them as if to Christ and welcomes them. Such humility, such welcomeness, such openness to just welcome and invite into belonging. So I struggled with this monastic thing for a few years. And when I went into, so I was college, when I went into seminary, my spiritual director, a priest who I got very close to in seminary, he suggested that I visit Mount Savior Monastery, a Benedictine monastery in upstate New York. I spent 2 summers between semesters with that Benedictine community, all the time trying to discern if I had a vocation to this contemplative monastic life. Well, I stand before you today, obviously I didn't. But I discerned back then that I was really drawn to this Benedictine contemplative life, but not to its monastic expression. Does that make sense? Not to the monastic way of this Benedictine contemplative way. Listening with the ear of my heart was drawing me in a different direction than into a monastic community. So I wasn't drawn to live in a monastery. And I went on to be ordained a priest, began mostly parish ministry, but again, I taught high school for a few years as well, but always connected to parish ministry. But this thing kept pulling at me, and I wasn't sure what this thing was. Then in the midst of this discernment in my life, the greatest gift of my life happened, and I met Mary, who we fell deeply in love, and we decided to marry, and which meant I had to leave the Roman Catholic Church and priesthood, and we journeyed forth. And Mary and I were blessed to be introduced to Jerry Gallagher. He was the rector of the Church of the Messiah, the Episcopal Church in Rhinebeck, New York. He welcomed us with such an open heart. He didn't quite bow to us, but I'm telling you, his welcome, his hospitality, we belonged. He opened his heart to us, and we were married there 35 years ago. Actually, a couple weeks ago, we went up to Cape Cod for a couple weeks to celebrate our 35th wedding anniversary. But that Church of the Messiah began our journey into the Episcopal Church. And this journey led me to realize, and here's the connection here, if I can explain it well. This journey led me to realize that the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Communion, is deeply rooted in the Benedictine tradition. It's liturgy, morning prayer, midday prayer, evening prayer, Eucharist, all that we do in prayer. It's polity, the way it does church. That's what the word polity means, how you do church. It is very Benedictine. It's very collegial. All voices heard. Talk about listen. You can go to a diocesan convention and there's a lot of listening, and that may challenge your listening to the core, because a lot of people speak, but listening, hearing, where is the Spirit working in our midst? Where are we called to? It's that collegial style of leadership, listening to all in the community. That is Benedictine. And the Episcopal Church is a church that practices that Benedictine hospitality and welcomes all as Christ. It's a church that listens to new understanding. And that's part of the Benedictine tradition. What does the Episcopal Church say about this? Well, we're trying to discern that a bit. We're trying to listen where the Spirit is leading us. And we've been through that together here at St. Paul's, as the Spirit's guiding us to new understandings and new ways. And it's that ability to listen and being comfortable and safe to do that. That's very Benedictine. And I remember, I'm not sure if I'm explaining it well, but I remember just tears came to my eyes when I came to realization what God had been doing in my life all those years. It wasn't about the monastic life. It wasn't about becoming a monk. It wasn't the Trappists. It wasn't Mount Savior Monastery. It was the Episcopal Church. And its Benedictine style of being church. I could do a whole probably series on that, but I had found home. When I discovered the Episcopal Church, I had found home. I belonged. And I took with me the family I had been a part of, another denomination, another tradition, and took a lot of that with me. This wasn't some kind of a struggle for me. I just found I could be who I've always been, who I think God was calling me to be. And the Episcopal Church had room for that, and I belonged there. So I thank Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk, for opening my heart to this Benedictine tradition that started in 1973 and led Mary and I to the Episcopal Church in 1986. So what does it mean to belong to the Episcopal Church? For me, it means everything. It means belonging to one another. It means listening to one another. It means offering hospitality to one another. It means worshiping, serving, and growing together. It means worshiping together, praying together at those times of our lives when we need the community to walk with us, which I've seen throughout my life, in my parents' life, in parish communities I've been a part of. We need the community to walk with us at times of joy, times of sadness, times of loss, times of celebration, times of illness, times of birth, times of separation, times of death, times of commitment, times of heart-fulfilling joy and wonder, times of forgiveness. All the times of our lives, we belong to each other. It means serving as we make the circle of belonging wider by providing pastoral care for one another, welcoming the refugee, reaching out to the farm worker with support and relationship, working with others to bring about affordable housing in our community, providing food during this pandemic, providing, just since January, we did this the other day, we asked Brandy to give us this information. Just since January, over $18,000 from the clergy discretionary funds has been given to folks in our community to buy food, to buy prescription medications, to pay rent, to pay medical bills, and so much more. Folks who call us and contact us who are in some of the most horrific times in their lives. Because of your gifts to the rector's discretionary funds, clergy discretionary funds, we're able to reach out and help people. 2 years ago, it was $1,200. Since January to now, it's $18,000. That has made a difference in serving folks in this community because of what you've given to help do that. It means growing as we open ourselves to grow and be transformed by one another through adult formation, which you're doing right here, through children's formation, youth formation, our St. Paul's preschool that helps in the early formation as children as they grow. You know, I always say to the parents, we have different celebrations throughout the year, and the parents gather here in the church. Many of them not part of St. Paul's, but their children are here. And I'll always say to them, I just thank you. And I come before you in humility, thanking you for inviting us into your life, inviting us into the life of your child, inviting us to be part of the most challenging probably time in your life of raising a child. You invite us to be part of that. And we are humbled by that, we're honored by that, and we see it as a privilege. And to be part of those lives is just incredible. So belonging to the church also means supporting the church, giving to the church, giving of our time, giving of our talent, and giving of our treasure. This week you'll be receiving a letter from me with information about how you can make a pledge to St. Paul's operating budget for 2022. And I encourage you to look at that in the midst of all we're going through in this world. As St. Paul's continues, I'm telling you, we are continuing to move forward. So much of what we learned during the pandemic has set us up to continue to grow, continue to develop, continue to be who we're called to be. We've never turned around and stepped back. As Brian mentioned in his talk last week, and we've been quoting this all year, we don't close, we adapt, and we will continue to adapt in so many creative ways. We're doing it in the midst of our daily lives here at St. Paul's. And so your giving, your support is what will make that continue to happen. And for those of you looking around, some of you I know for years, some of you maybe not, but if you've never made a pledge to St. Paul's, if this is something new in your life, you don't even know how to do it, I just ask you to start someplace. Just to give what you feel you can give. Now, the biblical standard of giving is the tithe, giving 10% of our income. Now, everyone may not be ready for that, but it's a hope. It's what the biblical tradition sets before us as something to work towards. But maybe we just begin where we are. Perhaps you look at your pledge, and what percentage is that of your income? Maybe 2%. 3%. It's called proportional giving. To be aware of that connectedness, to realize that with all that I've been given and blessed with, I can return some of that to make a difference. And each year, seeing if one can grow by 0.5% or 1%. That's what proportional giving is. And if our income changes and increases, 2% is going to be more next year than it was this year, even if we stay at the same percentage. And also the reverse. Folks who retire, folks whose income changes dramatically, they may need to adjust as well in a different way. But it's that idea of realizing the call we have to belong to this community and support this community in stewardship. So I encourage you to look deep, to see how the sense of belonging to this community is so significant in our lives and in the lives of those who've been drawn into the circle as it's gotten wider. As we await a new family, a new refugee family, we're waiting to hear that any day now. We've welcomed 8 families into this community, in this area. It's just one of the ministries we do. There's so many. So all I say to you is, what does it mean to belong to the Episcopal Church? Just belong. Just belong. Just be with us and realize we're challenged and called to expand that belonging and share this joy, share this treasure that we have beyond ourselves so that we can make a difference. We have so much to do next year in 2022. We've brought folks on to support us. We've expanded, looking to continue our ministries. So join us, be with us, and continue to walk with us together. So thanks. That's what it means for me to belong to the Episcopal Church. And just wanted to put those thoughts out there with you. More of an experience, and hopefully it can shed some light on your experiences where you've been blessed.